Welcome to the Visiting Writers Forum, and we want to thank the Creative Writing Department and the Iserman Family Foundation, which is providing support for this program. We are so lucky tonight to have Gloria Muñoz as our visiting writer. She was born in St. Pete and is now St. Pete's Poet Laureate. She went to school at Sarah Lawrence College and got her MFA at USF. She has traveled all over the world with particular stops in Italy and India that I hope we'll get to ask you about later. And her book, Dawns Early, won a super big poetry prize, the Ambrosia Prize of the Academy of American Poets, a great honor. So we're really happy to have her with us tonight and have her talk about her journey. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Okay. Thanks so much.
Great.
Great.
So maybe you could, take us through, you're talking here to college students. Maybe you could walk us through kind of your launch from college into the world of writing.
Yes. I was very fortunate to go to an arts high school. So I'll start there. And I studied theater in an arts high school, and I loved theater, but I was somebody who really liked the visual artists and hanging out with the visual artists. Like, they were more my speed. Like, I wasn't like ready to break in a song all the time like some of my musical theater friends. And by hanging out with visual artists and sort of working with students from other disciplines, I began to think about how artists work across disciplines and collaborate with disciplines. And so I did a lot of like random things that you do when you're in high school and you think will do really well, but are just like exciting experiments. So like we did, we went to like the top of a parking garage and would do like shoot short films in like a day and do like costume design and like do all like anything that I was like, oh, I'm curious about this. Like I started just trying out with friends from different disciplines. So going into college, I wasn't sure what I wanted, but I knew I wanted something involving the arts. And I was really interested in writing. I just always liked stories. I didn't really know that you could be a writer. I didn't know how that process worked or how something went from being an idea to being a book until much later. I just knew that I really liked the act of storytelling and the act of just like making art, like whatever that looks like with other people. So I went to college, I went to Sarah Lawrence, I loved it. It was like a little bit of a shock to the system because it's a private school like Ringling, and I come from a household that could not afford a private school. So I was a scholarship kid there, so like it was shocking in many ways, but it was incredible. Like the professors were phenomenal, and it was one of those schools that was like, take whatever, like take a smorgasbord of classes and then go from there. And I did. I took like astronomy and poetry and filmmaking and psychology courses and like children's ed courses. Like I kind of like dabbled, and as I was doing that, I found poetry and found myself in a poetry workshop. And after that workshop, it was my first poetry workshop was with Jeffrey McDaniels, who's a really incredible poet. And after that, I was like hooked. I was like, ooh. And then again, that question came, right? I think if you're a creative person, your life often follows a series of questions. And then I had another question about like, okay, how do I fit poetry into this life? And like, what does that look like? What does that mean? Right? Which is a question that I'm still answering, I think, every day. Like, it's not one that that's ever going to be static. It's always going to be changing and hopefully growing and deepening and evolving in a really fun way. So yeah, I think after that class, I was like poetry, and then there was like kind of like no looking back, which is bold and fun.
So poetry is one of the threads going through your journey, but also you're kind of an activist and someone who's interested in different cultures, multicultural literacy and that kind of thing. So how did you get into that?
So I grew up in a bilingual household. Both my parents immigrated from Colombia, and we spoke Spanish in our house growing up. And I was always exposed to people who were different from me. My mom's an ESL teacher, and she made sure, like, you know, somebody didn't have a house to go to over the holidays, they came to our house. We had a little extra sometimes, let's take it to so-and-so, or, you know, see how we can collaborate and like meet up with people and make community, build community. So like refugees from everywhere were something that I came into contact with very early on, and that I just like saw as like people, as like human beings, just like living their lives, trying to figure things out, right? And that question of like, ooh, by some dumb luck, right? I was born on here, and they were born in a different place, and they were born at a time in which, you know, time intersected with chaos in some way, and they needed to make a change. They needed to cross a border or do something different. And that realization came really early on, right? So that question of like, how can we help each other? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing socially to engage with one another is one, again, that I've grappled with and kind of sit with and think about a lot in my work and just like in my life as a person.
Do you see some activism in being a writer?
Oh yeah, I think writing, yeah, it's a political act. Honestly, like I think most art is. If you are making art, you are saying something. And you're typically moving against monetization. I think, you know, art doesn't make sense. Like writing doesn't make sense. Like writing for a living kind of disrupts a system that tells you there's many other ways to help and bolster our economy, right? Practical, very, very lucrative things. So for me, yeah, writing is totally political. I don't shy away from topics that are social or difficult to write about. I do think that there are ways to approach political and social topics that will engage people and kind of open dialogue a little bit more than others. But yeah, I knew like I wanted to set out to write about questions that I have and things that I'm passionate about and care about. And oftentimes those are, you know, climate change, immigration, gender equity, etc.
So how did you get from, you know, you graduated from Sarah Lawrence, and then how did you get to Italy, and then later to India? How did that fit in?
Great questions. Has anybody here studied abroad or like gone abroad for like study abroad? A few of you? Okay, awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, if you get an opportunity, study abroad. It is awesome. Or if you get an opportunity later on to do something in another country, again, I know there's a lot of privilege that comes with that opportunity, but go for it if you can. Yeah, I studied abroad in Italy and as an undergrad, and I studied printmaking. And again, it was one of those questions that I had. I wanted to write poems, and I wanted to work with lithographs. So I wanted to learn how to make etchings and how to sort of print. So I learned in Italy, like I ended up staying a little bit longer. I ended up staying longer in both places that I studied, and then going back later on in life to work with these same people because I was so attracted to the history of this place. Italy seemed absolutely dreamy, but it was also like a place of story and a place of poetry. So I did a series of poems and lithographs inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy while I was there. And I also did just a lot of research on that question of like love and the symbolism of love and sort of how it's constructed and reconstructed again and again and again throughout art and through poetry. And then I went to India later on, and I taught playwriting there. I taught playwriting at an NGO in India, and that was fascinating. It was one of those things where they were like, okay, well, you have some time here. I was working with an organization. That's what took me there. And then I was like, well, what can I do like in my community here? Like while I'm here, like everywhere you are, like hopefully at Ringling too, like you're going to school here, but hopefully you're stepping outside of the Ringling bubble, hopefully. I imagine there is a bubble just from the faces that I'm seeing here, like being like, yeah. Hopefully you're popping that bubble every now and then to look around and say like, oh, well, what can I do like while I'm here now, like in my community, right? If you're a filmmaker, if you're an animator, like whatever it is that your skill set is, like how are you like reaching beyond, right? And how are you like working with other people? So that was a question I had there, and that's what led me to then working with an NGO and teaching playwriting to kids who were kind of like in transition from being in like what would be kind of like a foster care, like it was an orphanage, but it'd be like foster care, like they were there for the long term, like they were there, like the orphans who were kind of like, who aged out. So they were figuring out like what they were gonna do. And playwriting was one of those classes that was voted upon. Like honestly, the first day we stood in a circle and I had a translator with me because my Tamil is so bad. Like I was, you know, I had as much communication and as many words possible, and still I think I need to study that language like for another 20 years to really be able to communicate. But I had an incredible translator, interpreter who was with me, and I said like, well, what do you all want to do? Like we have 6 months together. What's interesting to you? Like, what do you want to work on? And playwriting kept coming up. So I was like, well, let's do it. And this was definitely one of my first fake it till you make it moments, because spoiler alert, I had never taught playwriting before, but I had read plays, I had been in plays, I had written plays, and I was like, I could teach playwriting. Let's do this. And that was actually one of my first writer-teacher experiences. It was just kind of like on the fly, and it was awesome. It was one of those experiences that I like think about, and it seems like a dream. Like it seems so long ago.
Yeah. So in addition to being a writer, you've been teaching. You taught at Eckert and the University of Tampa. You know, was that clear to you that that was the direction you were going to go, or were there other things you were considering? I mean, you were just writing poetry all along the way, but.
That's a great question. So in college, I was a work-study kid, and I got to work in this very cool office, which was like it was, I think, what would be equated to like an LGBTQIA plus space nowadays. Back then it was, I think we called it like the safe space or like the open space. And it was like a space for queer and like first gen students, and just I worked as like a workshop leader there, and like I kind of monitored the space. Like I just sat there, like I was like, if anybody needed like Jenga, I was like, I'll bring Jenga to you. But being in that space was very fun because I got to meet a lot of professors who were, you know, wanting to do programming and wanting to sort of work with students and like have different opportunities, and that sort of got me thinking about teaching in general and like how that is a means of sharing art and craft and of working with people you care about, right, students. So I started kind of like lightly teaching then, but it wasn't until grad school where I really sort of got into being a GA and trying that out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned that you're juggling a whole lot of things. You're the mom of a toddler, right? And you're teaching, and you have this Pitch Her Productions, which is a film company that supports female identifying artists. Is that right?
Yeah.
And now this Moonlit Musica.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit? You talk about that as applying creative arts to industry. So could you talk about how you kind of juggle all those different things?
Yeah. So Pitch Her Productions, I was living in New York after college, and I stayed there for quite a while, and I had a lot of friends who were filmmakers and who were actors. I had a lot of actor friends. Again, I sort of went to a creative arts high school, so a lot of those people were now in New York, and we were meeting up in our late 20s, being like, oh, we're all here. What are we doing? We were all struggling. We were all very broke at this stage of our lives, and we're all trying to figure out, well, like, how does one live a creative life and eat dinner, which is like the conundrum, right? So we were sitting once around a coffee shop table, like me and a few friends, 2 other friends who are actors, and they were like, you know, we've been on some film sets lately, and these are 2 female actors, female identifying actors, and they were like, and they were horrible. Like, they were so just like toxic. Like, they just couldn't believe like some of the stuff that was sort of said, thrown around, the crew, and like how some of the crew was being treated, and the disparity, like the gender disparity. So like typically you have a statistic of 80% sort of or more male crew in film, 20 or less female or non-binary. Like, it's just as mainly very male dominant. And they were like, well, what if we started a production company and just kind of like did things? Like, we're not making any money at this anyway. Like, let's just try this out. And I was not acting at the time, although I had acted in my far past, but I didn't consider myself an actor. I was like, this is for you all. I'm not a film person. And they were like, no, you're gonna write films for us. And again, I had never written films. But these were 2 people I really trusted looking at me, telling me that I was going to write films. So I said, naturally, yes. And it was one of the best yeses I've ever said in my life, I have to say, because then we went on to build this production company for women and non-binary artists in film to find community. One, like, we ran a screening series, like a film series, in which we called it the Riveter series, in which we screened a bunch of films and like had sort of like mini film festivals that highlighted these voices, that highlighted voices on the margins. And then we also went into full production, and we did everything from like super scrappy web series. Then we got some funding and we did some great shorts. We did festivals together. We went to Sundance. We did a commercial for like a cruise line for Celebrity Cruises, which is like run by all female captains, which was like so cool. And they found us on the internet. The internet works. Get a website. Yeah, and it was just one of those things that like just evolved. Like, it kind of evolved and moved and grew and became this like super rad ride of just filmmaking, and not knowing, like, my gosh, we would go to like Costco at like right before they were closing, honestly, like in Queens, like running around, like filling, like we were doing craft services. We would like fill these shopping carts with food, go take it to an apartment, set up craft services for the next day, like wherever the location was, go pick up rental equipment, right? We're printing out scripts for people. We were doing like everything ourselves, especially at the beginning. We eventually were able to grow our team a little bit. But it was fun. And it was one of those experiences that like led us to, again, meet other actors. And like our last web series that we did, it became national kind of production because of, one, the pandemic, but before the pandemic, there was, I don't know if you all remember this, a couple years ago, the government shut down. Like there was a government shutdown. There's been a few like in the near past, but there was one in particular where I was in New York for a film shoot. I feel like it was like 2019 or 18, and I had to fly back, and I couldn't fly back because the airport was shut down because public service workers walked out, right? They were on strike. But seeing that around the world, and then seeing how public service workers and people who are essential but sometimes treated like garbage, we're making it through, and we're being treated at like these times. We put together this like last series, which was filmed across the U.S., and it's called Public Service, and it focused like it's a episodic, where each episode focuses on a different type of public service worker. And it became something really meaningful to us. So that's something right now that we're in post for it. We've released it, and now we're kind of going to do some festivals and things like that. But yeah, Pitcher has been and was one of those like best yeses that I've ever said. And also every single one of our crews is 80% female or non-binary and 20 or less % male. And that will be forever and ever. And I hope we inspire other crews to think about what they're doing, right? I mean, we had like very hard and fast stats because we wanted to prove a point, but it doesn't have to be that tilted. It can be, just more equitable. And again, social justice is something you can write about and paint about and make art about, but it also has to be something you act upon in your daily life, right? A poem will only do so much, right? And then Moonlit Musica, yeah.
Pandemic too, right?
Moonlit Musica, yeah. So Pitcher, was born in 2014, I think, or 2013 or 14, right around then, and is still ongoing. And Moonlit Musica is a music production company that I have. And this was born out of having a newborn and not sleeping, ever. Like ever. So I was awake, and my spouse was awake, and we were very tired, and our brains were in that that fuzzy space when you're like so tired that you become ridiculous and like everything is genius, like everything you say is very good, very smart in this space. We were right there. And we started writing a song together, and he's a musician, I'm a writer. We were just like, this is pretty good. We were like, no, this is very good, right? So we just started doing that, like when we were awake really late, kind of doing like some random feeding or like figuring out like how to get this tiny human to not cry and just to like go to sleep. We would just write these songs, kind of like one-off songs, and then we're like, wait a minute, let's record this. Let's master this. Let's make a demo of this. What does it sound like? And we just kind of did this all in our house, and we were having a blast. So it became very fun. It just became something we started doing. Then a few months later, the world shut down, and we were in full pandemic mode, and we were at home all the time. And our baby at the time, infant, was sleeping a little bit more. And we just revisited this idea like, oh, like that was very fun. Like what we were doing there, just like being goofy, we're actually good at it. Like we're actually good at this. Like what if we work together? So we did. We started working together to create songs, both instrumental and songs with lyrics. That could be educational, some that could be more commercial. And then we thought about like what we're really excited about and into. And it was, I don't know, everything sucked. It was March. It was like March 2020 or like April 2020. It was like a bad time. And I was like, I want to write like holiday music, like full on, like bells, sleigh bells, like what you hear when you walk into Macy's, like blasting at you, like with the perfume in the perfume aisle. I was like, that's what I want to write right now. So we started writing holiday, just like writing. Again, not knowing what we were doing with this, we just started writing more songs. Like we started like building a portfolio of songs. Then from there, we, a few friends had like heard about this and they were like, oh, like this is very fun. Send us your demos. And we're like, okay. So we sent, like, we just put a bunch of stuff together, sent some demos, and we got our first jobs. And some of those jobs were like, we worked with marketing companies to do music. Like we've done music for like car commercials and like, we did a job for Google early on. And then we did that was a small job for Google. Then we did a bigger job for Google much later on once we actually like had legs underneath us and knew what we were doing. That was very, very fun, where they, gave us an assignment to take all their cloud services, rhyme them. They didn't know I was a poet, but I was like, I could do that. Rhyme them and put them to like an Animaniacs-esque song. So we did that, and like that was very fun. But like each kind of yes led to like a new opportunity, a new job. Thank goodness I was on like my holiday music high, like randomly when the world was a complete disaster, because that led to a record label, heard some of these tunes, and kind of pitched us an album. It pitched us a project and said, like, do you want to be the writers on this project? We really like the sound you have. We're looking for something that's like very hip, very fun, but also has a classic feel. So we wrote an album that we recorded with artists from all over the world during the pandemic, and the label sent out recording equipment, and then we had a studio we booked also through the label, which was great. Yeah, and it's become one of those things that like has grown in ways that I could not imagine. Like we do a lot with video games, with children's programming. Sorry, I touched the mic. What else have we done? Yeah, television shows.
You said you scored some TV shows.
Yeah. Television shows. On like we've done some stuff for Comedy Central, Netflix. The titles aren't public, but it's been like very fun, and they go from like being very kid-friendly to like adult humor. So it's been like fun to experiment and to sort of try out our sort of writing chops in those different areas.
So you've talked about this chain of yeses. Something comes along and you say, yes, I don't know how to do that, but yes, I will do it. Are there things that you ever say no to?
Oh yeah, there are. I think it's really important to say no, yeah. I think it's, and especially like all of you young people who are going to be out on the job force, who are going to be like, I want to please everybody and be the best at like whatever I need to be the best at. It is 100% okay to say no or to walk away from something that is not serving you. Always, okay? Your health, your happiness, your stability is more important, okay? So I will say that first and foremost. No is probably a word I love even more than yes. And those yeses, like when I do kind of give them out, it's because I feel like that full like Care Bear, like shooting out of my belly, like rainbow heart energy, where I'm like, how could I not say yes to this? Yes, and that's what you should feel like when you say yes. I don't know who said it, but like if it's not a hell yes, then it's a hell no, typically, and that's something I try to live by.
Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about the writing that you do, how it happens.
maybe what your writing day is like. I know members of your writing group are here, your critique group, and I think they said that you're very important to their writing lives too, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that critique group.
Yes, I would love to. They are the best. Nicole and Brian, thank you for being here. Yes, yes, yes. So do you all know what a writer's group is? A little bit? Okay. Does anybody have a writer's group in here? You. Awesome. Yes, you win here, okay? A writer's group is a group of writers that gives you feedback and also just like your community, right? You offer each other feedback, you read each other's pages. Something I really love about my writer's group is that we're able to bring first drafts to each other. First drafts are like, ooh, they're like these like beautiful ugly babies a lot of time, right? So we need to figure out like how to hold them with care, but how to also like, be like, ooh, let's look at this, or like, let's talk about the voice here. And they're these wonderful groups of people that I highly encourage you all to find in whatever your field is and whatever you end up doing to support you, right? It's a group of friends, it's a group of trusted friends, right? People you can trust with your work, and people whose work you also want to read and spend time with. You meet periodically or as much as you can. You make time for each other. My first writers group was I think in graduate school. I had my first writers group, and it was just a couple of people from workshop that we all really resonated with each other, like our feedback. We were like, ooh, like every time you say something, like it really kind of, something clicks in my head about my work that I hadn't thought about or that really is inspiring, like, can we hang out? And it just became one of those, like, let's hang out, let's bring a few pages, and let's share work. I can't encourage you to find a writer's group enough. Yeah, so do that. Be vulnerable, let yourself be vulnerable with new work, okay? There are a lot of writers who kind of like wait, and like don't show anybody anything until they're done, and that works for them, but that's usually like Stephen King. Like you have to, like when you're starting out, like just collaborate with people, show people your work, read other people's work, have a whole conversation about dialogue or voice together, right? You know you're in good company when you can nerd out about writing stuff and it's like interesting and fun. So yeah, writer's group, I would highly recommend. In terms of my own practice, I would love to say I wake up at 5 a.m. and write every day, but I don't. I am not a morning person. I operate in the morning because I have a toddler, so I can function, but I cannot like fully like write. I write at night typically. I write during the day. I get to my office and get to work an hour early. I teach at a college also, so I get there an hour early. I write in that hour. It's like almost like writing is the water or the air of my day is what I feel like. And I know it's going to be a part of my day. And so I fill in any space that I have with writing. And that's kind of how I've written for the past like 3 years. I'm not gonna lie, pre-baby it was a lot easier. But now that's how I operate. When I'm driving, sometimes I'll put on a playlist. Like I make playlists for books, sometimes I have playlists for characters, and I'll put that on and run these songs through my head, right? So I have a character right now who like, it's like heavy My Chemical Romance, and I'm like, let's go, right? And I'm driving, listening to this music, so then when I park and walk into my office, I'm in that headspace, and I'm thinking about this character, I'm figuring out what makes them tick, right? And I'm thinking about a scene, and then I sit down to write, and I'm like fully there. And that's very fun for me, like to sort of just, like writing happens off the page and on the page, right? So it helps kind of find those hacks for yourself.
So I'm also curious about what you read that might fuel your writing. And I had a little prompt from some people in your writing group to say, get her talking about Isabel Allende.
Oh yeah, my gosh, the best. Yeah, I love Isabel Allende. I have to say, Eva Luna is one of my favorite books ever, ever, ever. I read everything. That's the thing, is I read a lot. I read pretty widely. One of my favorite recent books was Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee, which was recommended to me, I think, by Nicole a long time ago, and is really fantastic. Let me think if there's something that like really stands out. Woman of Light by Kali Anise Fajardo. It's a recent read that was fantastic. Where the Wild Ladies Are. Trying to think of the author's name. I can't remember, but it's like Japanese, it's short stories, and it's Japanese, from Japanese folklore, like retold via short stories, and they're like kind of fabulous and speculative and just really wonderful. I read widely. I like sci-fi. Like, I think if I could just like be put in like a room full of beanbags and like read all my life, I would read like sci-fi and speculative fiction and be very happy. But I love sort of seeing how writers are doing the thing, right? How they're putting books together. So I try to read things that, like Weather by Jenny Ofel, that feel like totally different and fragmented and weird, but like really wonderful and lush at the same time. I love Carmen Maria Machado also. I don't know. Okay, good. Yes, 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 yes. Wonderful, really dark and heavy, but also sometimes funny and sometimes, you know, thought-provoking in new ways. Samantha Irby is another writer who I would say fits into that, like, even though she's hilarious. Has anybody read Samantha Irby? There's a book called We're Never Meeting in Real Life with like a wet cat on it. It's a yellow book that I highly recommend, especially it's like a good gateway into Samantha Irby. She writes about like heavy topics, but in a hilarious, outright like hilarious way, and has just like a very blunt, delicious voice. So I can't recommend her enough. And that's nonfiction. I read nonfiction, fiction, poetry. I read kind of across the board. Booksellers are the best. Booksellers are the absolute best. I will say, like, go to your bookstore locally. If you don't mind crossing a bridge, go to Tumbalo Books. And just ask a bookseller, like, what should I read? What do you recommend, right? Play a game, like be like, my favorite pie is chocolate silk. Recommend a book to me. And they will. Like, the booksellers are very excited about that kind of thing. So I recommend that. If you're not somebody who's reading, like if I'm talking about all these books and you're like, what are these things that she speaks of? Challenge yourself to read, maybe do an audiobook if reading physically is not your thing.
Cool. We're going to open this up to students in just a minute, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about writing and reading in a couple of different languages and your ideas about this multicultural literacy, which you say is kind of your spine, your core.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and you do translations too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the best and like funnest and most intriguing questions that I ever had in a workshop was by a professor who was like, do you think you could translate a language that you don't understand? And she asked the class that, like, point blank, and we were all like, absolutely not, no. Like, how? Like, what are you talking about, right? So the next day she brought in poems, like cut up poems, like stanzas, and they were in all different languages, right? And she was like, well, here, you have a week to translate the stanza. And I got a German stanza. Some people had Russian, like everybody had a different language, right? And she's like, you have a week. And within that week, that stanza was translated, right? Not necessarily well, but it made me sort of look up the poet, learn what they were writing about, right? Use whatever It was not Google Translate then. Whatever we had on the internet then that could help me translate something, use that, right? Or ask a friend who speaks that language to help me, right? It made me think about metaphor. I can't remember who the poet was. I can't remember what the poem was about, but I remember it had a metaphor in it, and I was like, oh my God, I have to translate a metaphor? But it made me think about how metaphors work and how they work in English versus how they work in German. And after that, like that exercise stayed with me for a very, very long time, clearly. Because after that, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to read like books in translation. And it's just something I've always done and always valued. There's a syntax to each language, right? Horror, oh my gosh, if you read like Scandinavian horror versus American horror, right? Versus Japanese ghost stories. They're all going to approach like the slow burn, you know, like the slow burn in a horror movie in a different way. And it is awesome to read. Like it's awesome to see that and to understand that. I mean, you can see it visually in a horror film, but it's also like when you read it on the page as a writer, you're like, oh, like this is how it's done. So that's something I highly value as a reader and something that I encourage you all to think about is like, ooh, okay, I woke up and I speak and think and dream in this language. But what is it like to do this? Or like, what is it like to think about this conundrum in Portuguese, right? And you need to read Portuguese writers in translation. Maybe you learn a language that you really love. I have friends who are opera singers who have learned languages because they're like, I want to learn to sing opera in a different language, and I have to learn this one, right? They could just speak Italian. A lot of opera singers speak Spanish, Italian, English, but they want to learn one other, right? Just being curious. It's like thinking outside of yourself. The world is very, very big. And it's a lot more interesting than, I think, just us. And then for multilingual writing and translation, this is something that came about with my late mentor, Jay Hopler, who I just like was a grad student and like was knocking on his door and was like, I heard you're into translation. I was like, I grew up bilingually and like have always kind of worked to translate, but like in a very practical way. Like I would translate things for my parents or like do stuff like that, like when I needed to, but not like in a artistic way. I was like, how is this done? Like, what is literary translation? Like, please tell me. And he was somebody who basically helped me out a lot and worked with me on sort of translating work. And now when I write, like if I write a poem in English and I'm like, I cannot figure this out, I'll write it in Spanish and then I'll go back to English and I'll go back to Spanish. And it's like better. It just is better. It's like even if the Spanish one never sees the light of day, like writing it in Spanish helped me make the English one better. Like because I'm thinking of language in a sort of sharper way.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Okay. Well, we have lots of students out here and lots of questions. So I saw Logan's hand go up first, and then Kat behind him.
Thank you so much for coming down here. This is all really cool information. I read on, I can't remember exactly what it was like a little handout of different things so we get some information about you. There was something called the Tin House YA Writers Workshop. What was that like? What did you find important and impactful? And if you were to run a workshop for writers, what would you put in it?
Great question. Okay, so Tin House is an organization. They're also a book publisher based out of Portland, and they're fantastic. I cannot recommend just checking out some Tin House titles enough, and they're sold everywhere. And the Tin House Writers Workshop, they do all these workshops in the fall, winter, and spring, and I did the YA. I was in the inaugural class, actually. It was incredible. For a novel, historical YA novel that I submitted. And it was a week in in Portland, but like off towards the coast. I can't remember exactly where we were, like on the coast of Portland. And we stayed at a writer-themed hotel. I had the Jules Verne room, which I had like tentacles going across the room. My bed was a time machine. There was like a submarine bubbling out of the ceiling. It was incredible. Very, very cool room. And we write. So a writer's workshop, typically what you do is you attend panels and workshops during the day with, you know, established writers in your area. And then you have some time to write, and then you have time for sort of community building and sometimes readings as well. And it's something I highly recommend. There's one, the New York State Writers Institute is one that invites undergraduate students, graduate students, and established writers as well. That's the first one I ever did. I was right out of college when I did that workshop, and it was in Syracuse, New York, and they offer funding. And it was one of those, like, I didn't know what a workshop was, and I was like, I'm applying to this. I was like, a week of writing in Saratoga Springs, yes, please. And that's one of those that sort of opened up, like, what a workshop was. If I were to teach a workshop, what would I put in it? It's such a big question, holy smokes.
You just got back from Texas, right? Were you in?
Yes, I just got back to, actually, I just got back from Texas yesterday, where a group of friends and I who met at the Highlights Foundation, which if you're into kid lit, anybody like YA, middle grade, picture book? Okay, the Highlights Foundation, like Highlights Magazine, you should write this down. They have a foundation in Pennsylvania, and it's the most beautiful place. It's like stunning, like forest, mountain area. And they have a lot of workshops. They have a lot of funding, like a lot of funding. So I would definitely apply for funding if you need it. And they have all kinds of workshops. Like they'll do like 2-night mini retreats. They have week-long workshops. They have the Unworkshop where you can go and kind of build your own thing. They have online stuff as well. And it's with really, really incredible authors. So if there's somebody you want to study with, like apply. Like, you know, they're very welcoming and very excited to sort of make this type of experience accessible. So it's worth a shot for sure. But yeah, if I were to create my own, I think it would have to do with more interdisciplinary art and sort of bringing a bunch of different artists together for a week, having them have some time on their own making work, but then bringing them together to work on something and seeing what happens.
That sounds really cool, and I think this college would be a good place for us to experiment with that as a student.
Perfect. Kat had her hand up.
Hi. So I saw your a recording of your interview. Tell us about your quarantine, and there was a segment in that where like it really resonated with me. You were talking about your process in writing, where you were going to your dad and asking about different things like in terms of like translation or cultural references, like does this sound right, or like is this correct, and then trying to balance that with other information from people who are still living in Colombia, or just people who know a little bit more about like current, like present day culture and the geography, and wrote it down so I didn't get it. Like my question is, what information do you prioritize in your editing process? Because I'm kind of going through that same scenario right now, where I'm like going to my dad and trying to be like, does this sound right? Like, what is actual Spanish like spoken in Mexico, and what is like of the Spanglish dialect? Like, what am I getting right? What am I getting wrong? And trying to balance that research out.
That's such a great question. Okay, so first of all, as a writer, like it's very thoughtful and useful to think of that question, right? And to put yourself in that space, right? Thoughtful because you want to think about who and where and what you're writing about, but useful also because you're going to get it right, right? You're going to make the people you're writing about sound like actual human beings, right? And not like caricatures. You're going to make the place you're writing about come to life because you're filling in those details, right? As much as you can, and then you're outsourcing, right? Getting other people to be like, oh, wait a minute. Like that would have been this specific kind of soda or this specific kind of thing, right? So that's research, right? What you're doing is research. So you're doing a good job by even just asking that. I typically like write as much as I can on my own. Like I write like, and it will be like a bad version, or I'll write in like, fill this in, like I don't know what I'm doing here. Come back to this, right? Or like, I need to know what year this random thing was made, right? So fill this in, right? Would it have been a factory with this kind of wiring or this other kind of wiring? I don't know, right? So I'll put those questions in for myself as placeholders, like in that first draft, just mainly so I can kind of follow the thread of the story and keep going. And then something I do, I'm a big fan of like taking a recorder, cell phone nowadays, and then having that sort of follow up, right? Whether it's with a family member or with somebody else who I'm like just interviewing and just sitting and being like, okay, now can you tell me about XYZ thing? And instead of like posing it as like, am I getting this right? I will actually like create a scenario. And this is something I really recommend, like be like, oh, like if you were at a bar, like, or if you were at this kind of setting, like what would it look like? Could you describe it to me, right? Because if you're gonna give them just like the one answer, one word answer option, they're just gonna be like, it would be brown, move on, right? So instead, I'm like, fill this scenario, what does this look like to you, right? And that's like kind of like good interview practice, like when you're asking somebody a question, you don't just say like, tell me this, you ask like, well, what does this thing in your life look like, or what was this experience in your past? Like, could you build that out for me? Could you describe it? And then record it. And you're gonna have so much better research, such better information to bring into your work, okay? And I will say like family members are fantastic. Use them when you can. And then maybe get another, like a secondary source, right? If that's like you're your primary source, or your secondary source, you're another source. Maybe you can look at videos from that space. You can talk to historians, talk to journalists, read a text. Like I write a lot about like Colombia in the 1940s and 1970s, like different time periods. I'm like, oh, so I'm gonna look at research, might be on a totally different subject, but a book written in that time, right? To also look at like sentence structure and like how that all works. I think that's very helpful. And then think of context, right? What was happening in the world at that time? What was happening in the country at that time, right? Context is everything, I think, for a story, right? A story cannot exist like in an enclosure, so you want to think about like what is happening in the world during that time period. A really cool story I'll share really quickly is during the pandemic, I was working on this novel, and through like honestly just like many emails and kind of going back and forth, I was able to locate the Peace Corps volunteer who helped bring my family over, my mom's family over from Colombia in like the late 1960s. And it was one of those experiences that I was like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to this person. And I was like, I wasn't even like done with the book. I was like maybe like, I was like 3/4 done with it. But I was like, I need to talk to him now, ask him all these questions. I'm writing about a time period that he lived through the aftermath of this direct time period. And this person is gonna be more objective than anyone in my family, right? And objectivity is important, especially when people, like when something feels personal and people, move around information, right? So we became pen pals, and then we had a bunch of phone calls together, and he's been one of those people that has been really, truly a resource for me and a friend. Like, it's awesome. But yeah, but once you have then all that information, then go in and fill that in, okay?
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Sorry.
For sure, for sure. Are you Mexican?
Yeah.
Um,
Mexican diaspora.
Awesome. Awesome, awesome. Sandra Cisneros has a workshop called the Macondo Workshop, Macondo, that I highly recommend. You can ask me after, because I know it's like, yeah.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yep, for sure.
I saw Sally had her hand up.
Yeah. I'm part of the crew, but I'm also listening to everything, and it's been great. So thank you so much, first Gloria, for being here and speaking to us and sharing your knowledge, and also Sylvia for all the super thoughtful questions. And my question was more related towards Pitch Her. Again, as you can see here, I'm a filmmaker, my camera, and I was wondering what type of opportunities, if any, would you have for college students or recent graduates?
Have you ever been to the Sunscreen Film Festival here in St. Pete? It's in St. Pete?
No, I have never.
Okay. I would recommend checking that out. I think Sarasota has a film festival too.
It does, Sarasota Film Festival.
Okay. I would say start where you are first, because it doesn't cost anything or sort of make you sort of move and shift like while you're in college. Do everything you can exactly where you are. So like, I don't know what the Sarasota one is called, but with Sunscreen, they have internships, right? And if you're an intern for them, you can attend all these panels with filmmakers for free. You don't have to pay for a pass. And that's in April in St. Pete, right? So you get to like literally go talk to like actors, filmmakers, DPs, and learn from them, okay? If you can participate in, if there's a local 24-hour or 48-hour film festival, have you ever done that?
No, I actually, shame on me, never been to a film festival.
Okay, no shame on you. This is, you're learning. Everybody's learning. No. But 24-hour or 48-hour film festival is actually like really fun. It's like a renegade kind of thing. It happens all over the country. It will feel like a fever dream, but you make a film. Like you get together with a group of people and you make, like write, everything, edit a film, score. It's like it's so wild. In either 24 or 48 hours. Typically 48 hours now, because I think they decided that in 24 hours everybody like drops dead, and it's terrible. 48-hour film festival, I think, is the way they shifted. And this is something that happens all over the US, and I think all over the world now. They became pretty popular, so there's probably some locally if you just Google 48-hour film festival. I would recommend trying one of those out because it's very fun. You learn on the fly, and you have to, just by the nature of like the teams you're put in, do more than one thing, right? So you might be a PA, and you might be a gaffer, or you might be a DP, and you might also write, etc. Right? You might act if you've never acted before. They might be like, we need bodies, somebody, you're gonna be an extra, you're gonna do this, and you do it, right? Which is what filmmaking is about. Like, it's like trying things out. It's like making like a world seem like a world when it's not, which is very fun. So I would say like try those things now. In the summer, there's so many internships with production companies, the Emmys, like the Emmys, you know, the organization has like an internship page as well. I would check that out. Like the Academy has, you know, internship pages, Sundance Labs. Like I would just start to sort of look at those and reach out and sort of see what they have available for somebody who's starting out. And then another thing I'd recommend is like make stuff right now, like just make stuff. If you look at any filmmaker or most of them, that's what they were doing. They were just like making work, like the early on, right? So find like a writer, find people who can like create a project and just like work on something together outside of class, like just make a project. So yeah, that's like my best advice for you at this stage.
Thank you so much.
For sure.
Natalie.
Hello. Really appreciate your thoughts. My question, I would like to start with a reference first because I was reading your poem Signals, and it felt really like family focused, and I could resonate with that. So it made me think about writing in 2 languages and how, for me especially, I kind of like connect one language with certain themes and one language with another. So it's really hard for me to write more personal stuff in English. So I was thinking, like, do you have that as well? And if you do, how do you go about it? Like how, because of course not everybody speaks your languages, so you kind of are put in situations that you have to deal with that, and I think many of us here have. So yeah, I was thinking how that looks like for you.
Yeah, great question. I'm pretty comfortable with either, but I think it's because I grew up with either. Like I, spoke Spanish first, and then, like, because it's what we spoke in our house. But then as soon as I was like out meeting other kids, like I was speaking English, like, so I think because I grew up with both, like I'm pretty comfortable. I would say, like, if you're more comfortable in Spanish, like write in Spanish, like write creatively, and let yourself explore that, and then see what it's like to then transfer that into English, like almost like translating that into English, just as an experiment, because again, it's like you could be writing things or letting yourself say things or do things or go places or explore different ideas in the language you're most comfortable in. Whereas if you're sort of thinking in a secondary mode or in one that feels like there's an obstacle or any kind of blockage, you might hold some of those things back, right? So I would really recommend that. And even if it helps, like you could just like talk through them, or if you have other friends or people in your community who you're like really comfortable with in your language, then I would just talk to them, be like, hey, I have this idea, like let's work this out, right? And creating that group and that community, I think, is really important.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is our last Visiting Writers Forum of this semester. We'll be back at the end of January with another visiting writer. And then if you're in a class, we'll have a workshop for you. But I just want to thank Gloria Muñoz again for coming from St. Pete's. St. Pete's Poet Laureate.